order of operations. So for us to solve problems that involve multiple things that are going on, like multiple operations, as we could say, right? So as we can look at the example 1, there's multiplication and a subtraction and an exponent. And if you go about this in whatever order you want, or that I want, we may not get to the right answer. So there is an order of operations to lead us to the right answer. And those steps are below. So if we look at this, we have P, E, and then MD, and then AS. So what does that kind of stand for? Well, it could go for please, right? Like we'll think of a saying to remember all of this. Excuse my dear Aunt Sally. Well, what does that actually mean in terms of math? Because that can't be math. And it's not. So the please is going to be for parentheses. The E, or excuse, right, it's going to be for exponents. The M and D stand for multiply, divide. And the A and S stand for add and subtract. So it means that we need to look at this order in order to solve. So when we look at the first example, well, the only parentheses we have is this right here, right? It's just 1 over 5. And so there isn't really any operations inside the parentheses, so we don't need to go ahead and deal with anything there. So we can just go ahead and say we did that part, right? There's nothing to be done, so we can move on. Now we look at exponents. Well, we can see we have an exponent. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Now, when we have 1/5 raised to the second power, right? So if we have 1/5 raised to the second power, right? What does that actually mean? Well, it means that we have 1/5 times 1/5. That's what that means. And so we just would multiply what's on the top, right? 1 times 1, and we multiply what's on the bottom, 5 times 5. So what does that become? Well, we get 1 times 1 is 1, 5 times 5 is 25. So we get 1 over 25. So let's go ahead and rewrite this whole thing over here now. We're going to go 5 over 6 times 3 over 5 minus 1 over 25, because we just went ahead and just did that right here. Now let's go on. So we've dealt with our exponents. The next thing is we need to multiply or divide. So we're going to go ahead and tackle this first. Well, when we look at this, right, if we're going to go ahead and do that, we notice that we have a 5 and a 5. So let's go ahead and just take care of that. That can just become 1, and that can just become 1, right? Because 5 over 5 is just 1. So we can just, right, we'll cancel out from across, right? So now we have a 3 and a 6. Well, if we go 3 divided by 3, that's 1. 6 divided by 3 is 2. So 1 times 1 is now 1. 2 times 1 is 2. And then we have minus 1 over 25, because that's what we still have to do, right? So we dealt with this step, and now we just need to go ahead and subtract. That's the only thing we have left to do. So notice we have 1/2 minus 1 over 25. So they are not, right? We don't have a common denominator, so we need to go ahead and solve for that. So we could go on this side, we could go ahead and just multiply 2 over 2. And then on this side, 25 over 25. And so when we do that, right, we're going to get to a common denominator of 50, because the least common denominator between those two would be 50, right? Because 2 can't go into 25, and the next number would be, right, for 25 would be 50. So let's go ahead and now solve. So we would multiply what's on the top, right? And then we multiply what's on the bottom. That was a really bad color. Let's do green. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have 25 times 1 is 25. 25 times 2 is 50. Minus 1 times 2 is 2. 25 times 2 is 50. So 25, right, so we have 25 minus 2, right, because we only subtract what's on the top, and then we keep our denominator. So we have 50 on the bottom, but 25 minus 2 is 23, and that's over 50, and that would be the reduced fraction, right? We can't reduce it anymore. So now let's go ahead and look at the next example. So we have example 2. We're going to solve this equation. So let's go ahead and just write, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So when we look at this, right, we have multiple things going on. When we think about parentheses, remember absolute value counts as parentheses. So the first thing we actually need to deal with when we look at this is actually the absolute value. So let's go ahead and tackle that first. So let's go ahead and go right, just 3 over 4 plus 1/2 squared divided by 1/2 absolute value, which is 1/8 minus 1/4, close absolute value. So we need to get this to a common denominator. So the fastest way to do that would be to multiply this by 2 over 2, which is just multiplying it by 1, right? Because it doesn't change anything. If you multiply something by 1, you still get itself, right? So we're just going to change the way we represent 1/4, which will still mean the same, will have the same value. So let's go ahead and now play that all out. So we have 3 over 4 half squared divided by 1/2, 1/8 minus, so 1 times 2 is 2, 4 times 2 is 8. Close that bracket, right, or the absolute value bracket. So now we can go ahead and go 1/8 minus 2 over 8. So that would be negative 1/8, right? And so I'm going to do this on the side right here. So if we have negative 1/8 right into absolute value, so what does it actually become, right? If we have a negative 1/8 with an absolute value, that means it's going to become positive 1/8, right? Because anything that's negative inside the absolute value becomes positive. So let's go ahead and just rewrite that now with 1/8. So we don't have to keep writing all of this all the time, the whole thing. And then this is plus 1/8, and we can just do normal parentheses. So now we've dealt with our parentheses, right, there's no more operations. And then now we can go on to exponents. So we would just go ahead and do with that. So let's just go ahead, and we know that, right, 1/2 squared really means 1/2 times 1/2. Well, what does that equal? Well, that's just equal to 1 over 4. So let's go ahead, right, and just rewrite it like that. So we have 3 over 4 plus 1/2 times 1/2, so that's 1/4, divided by 1/2, then we have 1/8. And I just lost the positive sign because it means the same thing to show both ways. So now let's go ahead and when we look back, we've dealt with our exponents, we need to go ahead and multiply or divide, right? So we have two things here. We have this division and we have this multiplication. And so because we have, right, division and multiplication, what do we do in this situation? Because if we tackle them one way or the other, it can get us to different answers. And so the rule of thumb is we work left to right, right? We always go left to right. So that means we're going to go ahead and tackle this division first and then this multiplication. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have 3/4 plus, and so in order to do division, right, with fractions, we're going to go 1/4, and we're actually going to change it to multiplication, take the reciprocal, so that's 2/1, and then we're going to leave it as 1/8. So now let's go ahead and still do this part. So we have 3/4 plus, well, we have 1 times 2, and then 4 times 1, but let's go ahead and just reduce this before we even get further. So this could just become, right, 1, this will become 2, because we just went ahead and divided both by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1, 4 divided by 2 is 2, so we have now 1/2. And then we have this as 1/8. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have 3/4 plus, well, 1 times 1 is just 1. 2 times 8 is 16. And now the only operation we have left is addition, right? Because we went ahead and did this multiplication and division. So now we just need to go ahead and add. So we need to get this to a common denominator. So how we do that, right? We can go ahead and just multiply this by 4/4. We get to 16 as our common denominator. So 4 times 3 is going to be 12. 4 times 4 is 16, plus then 1/16. So we get 12 plus 3, which is 13. And then we keep our denominator, which would be 16. So that would be our answer.